It wasn't that long ago that American conservatives would scoff at the idea that our country was afflicted with systemic racism all over the place. That's what the left kept saying. But in the process of scoffing, many of us missed that there was actually some systemic racism going on. And in fact, the left has worked to infuse it all over the place, including in corporate America, higher education, and the United States government. Here with a perspective on how is my next guest. Jeremy Carl joins us. He's a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and he's got a new book on the subject called The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. Jeremy, good to have you with us, sir. Thank you very much, and congrats on the new book.
Thanks so much, Vince. It's a pleasure to be on.
It is one of the kind of the ironies of this conversation that for so many years the right was like, systemic racism, will you please? We have real problems to get to. Will you stop lying to us? But it turns out we definitely have some, don't we?
Absolutely, and that's what I try to document in my book in almost 1,000 references over 13 chapters. You see it everywhere from the military to healthcare to entertainment to crime and everything. And it's just, it was kind of hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
And I just was trying to get that discussion going so that we could have a little bit more of a real talk rather than the talk the left would like us to have.
Right. The left dresses it up in euphemisms, but what they've done, especially over the last decade, is they've really accelerated normalizing racial prejudice, haven't they?
No, absolutely. And I mean, it's sort of shocking the degree to which this sort of stuff is just out there. And in fact, you have folks like America First Legal, Stephen Miller's outfit, just kind of suing right now, finally, just blatant racial discrimination in job hiring where they're like, well, you can only get this job if you're black or if you're foreign born or whatever. And that's not legal, but we've been so kind of beaten down that we haven't even been challenging it until recently.
Your book, as I understand it, sets out to kind of just compile a lot of this to show people what actually is happening in their country, because sometimes it's hard to see, or you might think that this is a one-off, but in your book, you cover how actually this is pervasive.
Absolutely. And I mean, I didn't try to write just sort of an angry polemic or just something that was going to get people riled up. I mean, it's a very even-handed book. I've been endorsed by scholars like Victor Davis Hanson and Eric Kaufman, and then sort of more popular media folks like Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk, and then the longest-serving member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming, and all it just took is for somebody to really compile it and sort of explain it and put it in a form that's kind of digestible to an ordinary person, and that's really what I've tried to do.
A lot of these institutions have tried to convince themselves that they're not engaged in racial prejudice, right? Like the idea is like, no, they dress it up. Like, for instance, the phrase anti-racism on first blush seems like the kind of thing that people would embrace. Of course, like we're all opposed to racism. I would sign up for anti-racism, but that doesn't actually mean what it pretends to mean, does it?
No, absolutely not. And that's what you really see with critical race theory. You see it with Ibram Kendi and people like this who kind of say that any disparity in any outcome by race is automatically evidence of racism. And so, with that type of kind of definition of anti-racism going on, there's really no way that a white person can win under that scenario. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of what you see is this conversation that is not really kind of connected to reality at all, but is really just kind of discussing the various ways in which white people have to be at fault for anything that the left sees in society that they don't like.
What kind of damage has this thinking and this pervasive systemic racism done to the country?
Well, I think it's done a lot. And I didn't just write this book for white people. That was something I kind of make very clear up front, because what's happening right now is, particularly when you talk to a lot of younger people, I was having this conversation with Charlie Kirk, and he was saying, when I talk about this with older people, they kind of are like, oh, I don't think we should even talk about this. It might be racist. But when I talk to younger white people about it, they're like, oh my gosh, this is happening in my school. It's happening when I apply for jobs. They get it. And of course, what's happening, unfortunately, then is that some of those folks, if they see that society is not really going to redress their needs, they are going to go down potentially some dark paths that none of us want to anybody to go down. And so really the only way that we're going to get a sort of social peace in the U.S. is if we kind of go back to trying to treat everybody as much as possible by the content of their character rather than saying, well, certain types of skin are privileged over other types of skin.
In other words, a merit-based, colorblind society in practice.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's one of the ways that this is becoming, I think actually in some sense, I think 10 years ago, your book title might not have even been possible. I think just people would be like, you can't say that like a white person could be a victim of anything.
Absolutely, you're right. And in fact, it's sort of interesting that you mentioned that, because even this was the sort of more moderated title, and I insisted on putting anti-white racism in the title. My original title was It's Okay to Be White. And I think it's interesting because that was acceptable to my editors. And then we finally went to the sales staff, and they said, I can't sell that book at Walmart and Costco. And I'm like, well, why not? I mean, it's okay to be black. It's okay to be Asian American. It's okay to be Hispanic. Why would it be problematic to say it's okay to be white? But in our anti-white environment, of course, this is seen as a great outrage.
Of course. Well, this it's so crazy. But also, one of the other pieces here is that, as you mentioned a moment ago, it's not just damage to white people that's happening in the country. One of the things that the Supreme Court hearings have revealed in college admissions and many other obvious examinations of what's going on with admissions in both elite high schools and certainly in colleges across the country is that there's broad categories of people who are being subjected to racial prejudice, including Asian Americans who are trying to get into some of these institutions and are being held back by virtue of their ancestry, their heritage, their color of their skin. That's the only reason that they're being knocked down the list.
Absolutely. You're seeing that. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that, but I think, and kind of indicative of where we are, is that when the Supreme Court, when the affirmative action case went before the Supreme Court this year, and the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action in college admissions, they went with Asian American plaintiffs to convince an all-white conservative wing of the Supreme Court to kind of strike this down. And that's because I think even among the attorneys, who I think were very savvy, they said, I think that conservative justices even will be uncomfortable in doing a ruling that might look like it's going to benefit white people in some way. So we're going to have Asian plaintiffs who, absolutely, let's be clear, they were being discriminated against. But even that kind of showed the discomfort level that people had in saying that white people might be being discriminated against in some fashion.
Yes. No, you're right. There's a kind of a reflexive discomfort around that, because psychologically, I think a lot of white people are, feel conditioned to not bring up when they feel like they've been slighted on account of that.
Right.
It's interesting. When I was a kid, I lived in Hawaii, and one of the features of growing up in Hawaii, I did for just 3 years. I lived there, and one of the features there is that very few people talk about is pretty pronounced anti-white racism, actually, among people who are there, and in fact they're big on calling white people haoles, which is another way of saying foreigners. And it was a weird phenomenon for me, because I was like, well, that's bizarre. But even ever since then, I think this is actually the first time I've even mentioned it on radio. It's like, I'm not going to bring it up as like some effort that, they were really out to get me because of my skin color. I think that it's not worth actually dwelling on that for the most part. But if it's distorting your entire system to the point that it's harming people, that is racial prejudice, it probably is worth mentioning.
No, that's exactly right. And in fact, I think the biggest thing I actually felt like I wanted to be conscious of in writing this book is I'm not trying to create a new victim class, and I'm not trying to whine to the refs. I'm actually trying to rally the troops. I'm trying to say, white people, we shouldn't be putting up with second-class treatment. And there's nothing shameful about asserting your equal rights. It doesn't mean that you're horrible and that your life is worthless just because somebody is discriminating against you. You should have the self-respect to stand up and say, we are not going to take that type of discrimination against us. So, and frankly, if white people just decided tomorrow that they weren't going to put up with that as a group, I think it would largely go away. This is not, white people are not a 1% minority in this society. So, it wasn't kind of meant to like create a new victim class. It's a way of saying, hey, let's everybody stand up for equal treatment.
Exactly. So that point is the most resonant, the last one you just made, which is like when you stand up in that way, what you're doing is you're saying racial prejudice of any kind is unacceptable. And you should acknowledge when it's happening to people who look like you. It's fine to do that. So in fact, like as you talk about the book title, it strikes me that language is really important here. For years, to the extent that the right has ever talked about this, or anybody has talked about issues like this, they would dress it up in the phrase reverse racism or some sort of half step acknowledgement of what was going on here. And I always thought that was insane, because I felt like you're not properly describing what's going on. You're using euphemisms to try and conceal your concern.
Right. No, absolutely. And I even had to train myself, to be quite honest, Vince. I mean, it was like we're so conditioned that it took me several times of even talking about this where I was just comfortable in saying, hey, it's anti-white, and we need to put that front and center and not just say things like critical race theory or reverse racism or wokeness or all these sort of euphemisms that we use to avoid really describing what is going on, because it makes us so uncomfortable as a society. I think if you can't describe the problem, you're not going to begin to really solve the problem.
Now, I will say, I don't think that our ruling class, or especially congressional leadership, is quite there yet in terms of being willing to just be frank about what's happening and to argue for what you and I are arguing for, which is a merit-based colorblind society that's free of all of this.
Yeah.
Do you get the sense that they're aware of it, but they're nervous about how to discuss it?
They're not there yet. I think they are nervous about how to discuss it. It's one of the main reasons I wrote my book, because I want us to be not nervous about discussing it and to not be, there's nothing to be ashamed about in discussing this. I can tell you I'm not going to out anybody in particular, but I can tell you there are multiple members of Congress who are reading this book right now. I may actually be appearing on a podcast with a member to discuss this book in the not such distant future.
I have a guess. I'm going to write down my guess right now, because I bet you I know the answer to this, but we'll see if I'm right.
Maybe. But yeah, I mean, there are folks who are willing to discuss it, but it's still not a majority. And again, my goal is just to strengthen in a way that is not histrionic, but very fact-based, that the cases of the people who want to talk about this issue in a responsible way. And then hopefully, if the people lead, the leaders will eventually follow, right? That's kind of where we're trying to get to.
Yeah. You know, one thing I think of sometimes is white working age men is a almost never discussed issue, but have been savaged by the changes in our economy and the government. You know, it's like, and as a result of the pressure not to talk about any afflictions for white people, I think basically the damage that takes place against them is often never mentioned or downplayed.
Absolutely, and there's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Angus Deaton, who with his wife Ann Case, also a prominent economist, has looked at these so-called deaths of despair among middle-aged white people. So that's everything from drug addiction to suicide and kind of similar things, or alcohol. And I get into that in the book and discuss it, because, again, you're right, we're not discussing it enough.
Yeah, not enough. All right, well, Jeremy Carl, thank you for writing the book and trying to make it more obvious and normal to talk about. Again, Jeremy Carl with the Claremont Institute. The book is The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. Jeremy, thank you so much for writing the book and for your time today.